Debunking anti-bond propaganda. All right, the last 2 days, I think, I've heard a couple things on negative on bonds, and I'm going to share an article with you from 1977 that did the same thing. I chuckle. People they don't. I don't understand this, but okay, we'll get into it. This kind of reminds me of the G Fund. You know the TSP G Fund? Everyone, their mom said, the G Fund sucks, blah, 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 until it doesn't. And that's the same thing with bonds. The bonds suck, until it doesn't. We're going to walk down memory lane to show you can't listen to these propagandas. You just can't. Anyway, so I was listening to that Forward Anything podcast. I think it's what it's called, and I can't remember the chick's name, and she has some other guy on there. And he's like, I don't touch bonds. You should stay away from bonds. Just do the barbell, cash and stocks. I'm like, I get it. I 100% like the barbell, cash and stocks, absolutely. He goes, because bonds are going to get crushed during inflation. Then I had a guy on my other channel, Josh Scanlon. So don't forget to subscribe to the Josh Scanlon YouTube channel. And I just repost videos from the previous year. I take whatever the most popular videos for the previous year and I repost them up on Josh Scanlon. And I'll do some other videos on there on occasion, but not much. So if you want to keep up from what I did before, let's say you're new to this channel or something like that, just go to Josh Scanlon. Don't forget to subscribe. Some guy on there who really is angry at me that I even discuss the benefits of reverse mortgages. He's like, how dare you? How dare you? He said, reverse mortgages are evil. And he said, bonds no bueno. And I said, okay, and we're going to show you why he's wrong. Thanks, girl. Thanks, Pablo. Pablo wants to join us, and we'll just show you why he's wrong. And then kind of remind me, there's an article I had clipped a long time ago from 1977. Small investor, likely loser on long-term bonds. Now, that's a headline. I can't say the author had written the headline, but this is the headline written in 1977. Small investor, likely loser on long-term bonds. And then he goes on to say, hold a second if I can find it. I dropped it right here because Pablo. The author goes on to say, there's a guy named Neil Leslie. A surefire way of losing money is by investing in long-term bonds during a period of high inflation. Well, the evidence is clear that taking taxes into account and any kind of commissions you pay, that's a losing proposition for the average investor. Admittedly, it's not so for banks and thrift institutions that may be purely involved with short-term interest rate swings, nor is it a matter of concern for a sophisticated bond trader. But the conventional theory, one that the late Benjamin Graham came up with, a balanced portfolio is flawed because you're depending on bonds. And then we're in a high inflation environment in 1977, and thus bonds you should steer clear of. And he could not have been anything further from the truth. All right, so let's go down memory lane. We're just going to use Ginnie Mae because Ginnie Mae is the only fund. We can actually use a different fund too. But we're going to use Ginnie Mae for the time being. Ginnie Mae was incepted in 1980 from Vanguard. So our first full year of Ginnie Mae was 1981. Inflation in 1981 was 10.3. I would say it's a high period of high inflation. Would you not? Yes, you would. Inflation in 1982 was 6.3. High inflation, would you say so? Yep. 3.2, 4.3. All right. So Ginnie Mae gave us a rate of return in 1981 of 4.8%, which is half the rate of inflation. Now we're taking $40,000 a year adjusted for inflation, all in Ginnie Mae fund. All right. So in Ginnie Mae, we got $1 million in there. We made $48,000. But we still had to take $44,000 out when you factor in inflation because we had a 10.3% inflation rate. All right, again, that would be a high period of inflation, would it not be? Of course it would be. And what you're going to see, if we're adjusting for inflation $40,000 a year or 4% a year, you can see by the time 10 years goes by, we're now taking $66,000 out. Obviously, we're losing money, right? No, our portfolio is worth $2.7 million. Go back to 2001. Are taking $85,000 out. Our portfolio is worth $4 million. I mean, that's just a fact. So the idea that bonds are a sure loser in high inflation simply was not correct. 10.3%, it was a high inflation year, and yet if you would have dumped into Ginnie Mae, you would have made all kinds of money. Now, it gets even better if you would have bought individual bonds, because this guy talks about buying an individual bond when interest rates were low. All right, so it's weird. He says, I kind of chuckled. He said, yeah, if you bought a bond I think it said 1948 with the interest rates of 2.75 or something like that. You got smoked by the end of the 1960s and the early 70s. I said, yeah, but what if you did the exact opposite? What if you bought an individual long-term government bond in 1981, 1982? You're getting 15 and a quarter guaranteed for 30 years. See how bonds work both ways? So the propaganda that being anti-bond is just it's just stupid. So let's even go back. We'll pick up another bond fund. Check this out. It was a federated government securities fund started in 1970. All right, so all government securities, again, doing the same thing, 4% a year, $40,000 in a $1 million investment. And you're going to see our money stayed until the end of 30 years. Right? So you cannot have done worse in terms of high inflation than buying the federated bond fund. But you can see right here, though, we're taking 42,000, 44,000, 45, and whatnot. By the time 7 years goes up, we're increasing our amount of money we're taking out by 53% essentially, and yet we still have money. Look, by the end of 1990, we still got $979,000. We're back to where we started. Was at 30 years later, 20 years later. 20 years later. By the time our last year on this earth, we finally ran out of money in 1999. So the money lasted for 30 years in the federated fund, even though we bought it in a high inflationary environment. Kind of crazy. Now, again, if you would have got sunk, if you would have bought a long bond, one bond specifically for $1 million in 1970? Yeah, because you probably would have made 6% or something like that of interest. All right, and that probably would not have sustained you. I don't know. We'd have to run the numbers. I just don't know. But the idea that anyone's buying that bonds are always inherently bad, you'll always lose money relative to inflation. You just didn't, man. You made your 30 years relative to inflation in this fund without question. I mean, it's just not debatable. And that was during the highest inflationary time there was. That's just a fact. You cannot then turn around and say bonds are always and everywhere a bad thing. You can't. You just simply can't. Let's compare two funds here. Let's compare the Ginnie Mae in 1981. We're going to go back to Ginnie Mae. In fact, let's go to the Putnam bond fund. I just want to show you something else too, because we go to Putnam. This goes back to it goes back to 1950 something. So we'll start in 1966. Again, this is just a Putnam bond fund in the worst possible time to have been an investor, 1960s. All right, excuse me. And we're going to take 40,000 a year adjusted for inflation, and even that lasted for 25 years. 40,000 a year adjusted for inflation, 4% in the Putnam bond fund. Even that lasted until right there, 25 years. Right, let's look at the same for the S&P 500. All right, say, okay, but Josh, the stocks would have done better. Would they have? Let's take a look. S&P 500 lasted in 1966. Just barely lasted 1995. Yeah, look, it lasted 30 years, but just that would be the last year. 31 years, you're done in the S&P 500. But remember, bonds don't keep up with inflation like the stocks do. Now, let's just say you had like what I like to use actually would be 4 buckets right here, 4 buckets, and this is what I'm working on, by the way. And we're going to use this as treasuries, and we're going to come down here as S&P 500. And we're going to do $1 million. That'd be 100 and what's that? 4. That's 160,000 in the treasuries and 840,000 in the S&P 500, and that looks good to me right there. 4 years of treasuries. The rest in stocks, you had by the time 30 years are up, you had, let's see, hold on a second, let's make sure I'm taking this out right. Yeah, you had by the time 30 years are up, you still had $1 million. That works pretty good. Now, if we instead of doing the treasuries, if you use we'll use Putnam again, because Putnam is our bond fund that goes back that time. Same thing. If you use Putnam as your safe money, so essentially, Putnam fund, you ran out of money in the Putnam fund in 8 years, but you still had S&P 500. You still had $250,000 in the S&P 500 by the time 30 years are up. So you still survived 30 years. All right. So the idea that the Putnam fund or bond funds just got crushed always and everywhere with inflation is just wrong. It's not even close to being correct. It's just not. It drives up to all the people. You can't have bonds. I'm like, okay. And that was during when you bought low in 1960s, and by the time 1980s ran around, your freaking bonds were crushed. You didn't even get any advantage of the higher interest rates you could lock in 1981, 1982. You could have locked in a 30-year government. Oh, that's what I want to do. So we're going to go over here. I don't know if I can. We'll do Ginnie Mae. Let's do Ginnie Mae. We're going to compare Ginnie Mae, Vanguard Ginnie Mae, to the S&P 500. We're just going to do this $1,000,000. We're not going to do any bucket strategy. It's just zero. And we're going to do here. And we're going to go back to 1981, and we're going to compare it to the S&P 500 at the end of 2011. All right, so Ginnie Mae, and not take any money out. We don't want to take any money out. Zero right there. Ginnie Mae was worth $12 million if you took no money out, just let it sit there and recumulate, reinvest. All right, so 12 million bucks. S&P 500 is probably worth a lot more than that, but let's see. I don't know. S&P 500 was worth 21 million bucks. So while the Ginnie Mae didn't keep even Steven with the S&P 500, it did remarkably well with a hell of a lot less volatility as well. All right, so just a fact. All right, so we took 4% a year off the Ginnie Mae starting in 1981. Let's take 4% a year off the S&P 500 starting in 1981, and you'll see they both had money left over. S&P 500 still had $12 million in the Ginnie Mae starting in 1981. I mean, you could not have timed that any better, either stocks or bonds, frankly. But just the idea that stocks, but you can, if you did half and half, you'd reduce your downside risk significantly with Ginnie Mae. Just fact. Because when S&P 500 was getting crushed in 2000, 2001, and 2002, 2007, 8, 9, Ginnie Mae was making money, dude. So Ginnie Mae was making great money in the 80s. S&P 500 was making great money in the 80s. The 90s, the S&P 500 was making great money. Ginnie Mae not so much. In the aughts, the Ginnie Mae was making great money relative to the S&P 500. Just a fact. But don't touch bonds; they get crushed. It's just not true. I mean, it can be true, but you know what's going to get crushed? The S&P 500. No. God bless. Love your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to either channel. If you haven't subscribed here, please do so. And of course, subscribe to my other one, and then paw the like button. We'll see you.